Domain 6 is implications of the study findings, otherwise study conclusions. Okay, what's the purpose? It's to assess whether the authors have made conclusions that reflect the study design and results. Signaling question 6.1 is, did the author's conclusions represent the study findings taking its limitations into account? Now, what do we mean by this? The study authors may have made conclusions based on extrapolation of their results and not on their data, which is poor research practice. Studies designed to look at the pathophysiology of disease or mechanism of action of treatment should demonstrate evidence of similarity between disease process in animal and human disease before arriving at conclusions regarding these aspects. So, um, the pathophysiology may be studied in the animal model, but how do you know that the disease process in animals and human disease was the same? Okay, how would you classify this signaling question? Okay, so classify this as yes or probably yes if the study authors considered all the findings and limitations of the study while arriving at the conclusions. Okay, now limitations of the study include deficiencies in any of the previous domains. So they should, or study authors should consider these domains and then indicate these as limitations. For example, they might say, okay, we did this study, this has to be replicated by someone else. The results have to be reproduced by someone else in a different lab condition. Or they might say, well, we have to confirm that we did a non-blinded study, so future study should actually include a blinded study. The assessor of the clinical relevance animal study, that's you, should make these judgments on domains before you answer this signaling question. And you should be aware of the deficiencies. So mark all the domains previously, and then only then you would know whether the limitations of the study were considered by the study author. These deficiencies should have been considered by the study author when making their conclusions. Now classify this as no information if it was not clear whether the study authors were aware of the deficiencies. For example, the discussion section does not include the limitations that you identified. Classify this as no or probably no if the authors did not consider all the findings and limitations of the study while arriving at the conclusions. That is, the authors recognized the deficiencies but clearly ignored them in arriving at the conclusions. The next signaling question is, did the authors provide details on additional research required to conduct first-in-human studies? Now, a study on investigator brochures in Germany demonstrated that animal study results were not evaluated well, for example, by systematic reviews of animal studies before clinical trials, highlighting that further research recommendations should be made taking other studies on the topic into account. Okay, they must put it in context. Or they must say, okay, this has to be confirmed by someone else. Okay, researchers should consider the limitations of their study before recommending first-in-human studies. For example, this may be the first experimental study on this research question. Therefore, the research question may not have been conducted in multiple centers. The authors should highlight the need for studies that reproduce the results by a different group of researchers before they actually recommend first-in-human studies. If the current study was a study to attempt at reproduction of the results of a previous study, then the author should clarify whether further preclinical studies are required or whether the intervention should be evaluated in humans with justifications. For example, repeating the study in preclinical models can be justified if the intervention needs to be evaluated after a modification. Now, the authors have suggested a modification. That means it has to be reproduced before it can be tried in humans. Recommending evaluation in humans can be justified if efficacy and safety has been demonstrated consistently in multiple preclinical models and centers. So, how would you classify this question? Classify this as yes or probably yes if the study authors have made future research recommendations based on the study design and results from this study in the context of other studies on this issue. Okay, so to be more specific, the study authors should recommend further preclinical studies if the current study was the first experimental study on this research question and therefore need replication or reproduction, or if the intervention needs to be evaluated after a modification. They could recommend first in human studies if the safety and efficacy has been demonstrated consistently in multiple preclinical models and centers. Classify this as no information if there was no recommendation for further research. Classify this as no or probably no if the study authors propose first in human studies despite lack of information on the reproducibility of the results in multiple preclinical models or after making the modification.